Well, what a countdown. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Workwell Community Live webinar. Carrie, how are you?
Hi, Brian. I'm good. That was a very dramatic countdown. All right.
It was
Very
indeed. It
good.
was indeed. That was brand new now. I might have to work on the audio with that, but it was quite dramatic, all right, wasn't it? So listen, our Workwell Live webinar, we're going to get started in just a moment. We'll give everyone just a moment or two to find their seats. Before we do, we're using something new here. We're using Restream. So whatever platform you're on, you can send us a note. You can comment. We should be able to see all comments no matter what platform you're using. So please do comment, ask us questions as we go. You start by letting us know where you're tuning in from. I know we've got quite a few different locations represented. I'm here by the Phoenix Park in Dublin. Weather's quite nice today. You're in Galway, Carrie?
In Galway, yeah, Brian. The weather is kind of grey, but it's looking up. It's looking up like it might brighten up a little bit. So nothing we can do in the west of Ireland.
Is it always grey in the west of Ireland, though, isn't it?
Yeah, we've had some really good weather the last while, but you can't escape the rain. You just have to accept it. No such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, as they say.
Exactly. Cool. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining in. We're Workwell Live webinar. Just saw this from Sid. Sorry. Sid is joining us from the Costa del Bray today. Thanks, Sid. You're very welcome. So yeah, Workwell community. We're all about sharing and learning here. So, and that's exactly what we want to do today. So we're going to break up the session into kind of two parts, if you like. We're going to talk about the ISO45003. So it's brand new, June 2021. It was published. It's the world's first standard for mental well-being in the workplace. So just to bring everyone up to speed, I'll introduce it. I'll introduce kind of the facts and the figures and what it's all about, and maybe some of the benefits as well. And then Carrie, you're in the middle of a live demo, if you like, a live case study. So you've gone through kind of some of the training courses that are available, and which we'll talk about. And you're actually in the middle of implementing it then as well. Like, I love the idea that the theory is so important, but then actually, how do you put that theory into practice? So hopefully we'll be able to answer quite a few questions today and introduce as many people as possible to the standard. So I'm just seeing Amanda there from Somerset. Cloudy, sorry to hear that, Amanda, but you're very welcome to join. And we've got Cork represented as well. So a nice spread. I know we have Brussels, we have Amsterdam, and we have Australia as well, as far away as Australia registered today. So everyone is very welcome. Okay, so I'll kick off. I'll do the introduction and then we'll hand over to Carrie. So if at any stage you can't see my slides or hear me, just let me know. So here we are. Big welcome to everybody again. So we're here for ISO 45003. So if you're hoping to get the lottery numbers from last night, I think that's a different webinar you're looking for. Okay, so I just want to set the scene first of all, just so we're kind of clear on exactly the area that we're talking about here. And let me know in the comments who's familiar with the WHO, their healthy workplace model. It dates back to 2010, but it's still it's a really foundational document. It's actually the first recommended reading that I have for students on the postgrad in Trinity, and it's also the first recommended reading for anyone that takes my online course, my 8-step framework course. So it's a really foundational document, and in that document they have this model, if you like, which introduces a lot of the different areas, if you like, that we should be concerned about when it comes to a healthy workplace. And I'm just for the purpose of this session, I'm just looking at the outer bubbles. Okay, so the outer circles. So we're all familiar with the physical work environment, I think. So traditionally, this would have been the realm of traditional health and safety, if you like. So the physical work environment, physical health and safety. Here on the right, we have the personal health resources. So this might be anything that's focused on the individual. Anything from a bowl of fruit, exercise classes, an EAP program will be directed at an individual. So anything an individual can access, that's what we're talking about here. In this outer bubble on the right, here's one that's this is back in 2010, which wouldn't have got a lot of attention back then, but I think we're we're all a little bit more focused on it now, the enterprise community involvement. And that could be, now we're talking about ESG. Of course, CSR has been around for quite a while, but this is anything almost, if you like, external to the company. So individuals, colleagues volunteering in the community, the organization themselves doing something for the community or partnering with the community initiatives. It could even be extending to family, friends of workers as well. So just extending just a little bit outside the organization, kind of the wider community. But here, so this circle on the left, the psychosocial work environment. So this is the area we're talking about today. And this is the area that ISO 45003 addresses. Psychosocial work environment, the mental well-being work environment, if you like. So I'm a recovering project manager, so hopefully that helps set the scene. It certainly helps me just understand, exactly what we're talking about. And here's another one kind of to help set the scene as well in terms of the levels of intervention. I think this really articulates well what a powerful tool 45003 can be. So we may or may not be familiar with the different the 3 levels of intervention, of well-being intervention. I think a lot of us will be familiar with the tertiary intervention. So this is like your EAP programs, excellent programs. But an EAP is something that an individual would access, but only when they already have certain issues. So they're accessing this. It's a tertiary intervention, if you like. It's to treat issues that are already there. Secondary interventions, then you might look at these as so we're managing issues again that are probably already there. But it could be as well awareness training as well. So highlighted here we have stress management programs, mindfulness training, resilience workshops would be in there. Your mental health first aiders would be in here as well. So it's awareness. So a lot of us would have these interventions already in place within organizations. ISO 45003 is here to support all 3 levels of intervention. But I think, from my understanding, most organizations would be weakest in the area of the primary interventions. So the areas where we can actually prevent issues. So I think this is where ISO 45003, where we can get real value from, and it will really demonstrate how powerful it can be, because it can bring the focus back to organizational level issues, as opposed to these kind of addressing issues that are already have already taken place, of stressors that are already there. So I think we can really kind of try and prevent issues with the adoption of ISO 45003. So hopefully that kind of, again, is just another good, it gives a good sense of what we're talking about today. Here's kind of the basics. It's the first global standard. The angle I like is that it comes at it from a risk management perspective. And I know that mightn't sound like the sexiest thing in the world, but it really does. It kind of brings it in line with traditional, let's say, physical health and safety. It just treats it the very same way. So it gives us, it's a how-to guide, if you like, in this area. It shows us how to identify and recognize hazards, psychosocial hazards. And even better, it gives us examples, really, really good examples of effective actions that can be taken. I always like to include a slide on why should we care about this. So this is almost like your benefits slide. So I hope it goes without saying that if you're building a psychologically safe, a healthy and safe work environment, it's going to make your organization much more resilient. It's going to improve performance and productivity without question. And I've just called out some other benefits there as well. I mean, almost by default there at the bottom, you're also being legally compliant just by following these processes. So many benefits. Psychosocial hazards, just to kind of, 45003 kind of calls out psychosocial hazards that we should be aware of, and they break them into 3 categories. So it could be how work is organized, social factors at work, and then the work environment, equipment, and hazardous tasks then as well. So 3 different headings, and they go into great detail on each of the 3. in the document itself. So I'll just give you two examples. So the first was how work is organized, and on the left, so roles and expectations. This is just one bullet point from the work organization field. And look, here's some examples, just a few examples. Is the role ambiguous? Is there conflict within the role? Look down the bottom there. Here's a really important one. Is the individuals in these roles, are they performing work of little value or purpose? Is there expectations within a role that undermine one another? Uncertainty, frequent changes. So you get the idea, and that's just one example within one of the main headings. So there's lots more of this within the document. Here's the second main heading was social factors at work, and here's a really important area. So interpersonal relationships at work is called out. Poor communication, poor information sharing. Here's a big one. So poor relationships between managers, supervisors, co-workers, anyone we might interact with. Interpersonal conflict, there's harassment, there's bullying in there as well. There's a whole other section on leadership and leaders as well. So lots more, but hopefully that gives you a good idea there. Look at the bottom there again, actually. Here's another social factor we think we've all been aware of over the last 18 months or so: social or physical isolation. So that could be that's a psychosocial hazard. So something to be aware of. So are we noting this? Are we documenting this somewhere? And are we doing something to eliminate that risk, or to substitute that risk, or to mitigate that risk? So that's kind of level, that's kind of detail that 45003 goes into. And I added this one in because I think, and Carrie, you're going to get to this in a lot more detail now in your own kind of practical example. But how do we identify a hazard? It's a really good question. And it's the obvious one that everyone would almost jump to is the survey and the focus groups. And yes, absolutely, that is a way to do it. But there's so many more ways to identify a hazard. We could look at the tasks and schedules that are already in place, job descriptions. There could be others, that performance review. So your annual reviews, exit interviews is a great way to find out what's going wrong in the organization, what annoys people, what frustrates people. That's kind of what we're trying to get at here. Incident reports, of course. If you have statistics from the broader industry level, that could be useful. Any compensation claims, of course, your absenteeism and attrition data, that might give you some rich data, and then the surveys and the focus groups, as I mentioned. I'm not seeing now. If any comments or questions, just let me know. I'd be happy to take some. Oh yeah, so Maria, thank you. Oh great, you're doing the course tomorrow. I'll come back to the comments now in just a moment. Oh, hi Mary. Mary's tuning in from Galway. And Neve is asking, will we receive a copy of the slides? Neve, I don't see why not, Neve. I think we'll get a copy of the slides out to you. I'll include that I'll send an email with a couple of resources afterwards. So yes, I'll include a copy to the slides. Now, just kind of the nuts and bolts, if you like, of 45003. Because, if you're looking at it initially, it might feel just a little bit daunting. But I think if you break it down, it's actually really manageable, and it's really easy to understand. So if anyone's familiar with any other ISO standard, it follows the same guidelines and structure of any other ISO standard. There's 10 core clauses. Clauses 1 to 3 are simply where the standard is defined. There's some definitions in there. There's just some kind of housekeeping in there as well. It's very much an introduction, clauses 1 to 3. Then clauses 4 to 10 is where we really get into the detail. So the requirements for compliance with the standard. And it's done in a way, for implementation, it's actually really nice. It follows the plan, do, check, act kind of cycle for continuous improvement. So for example, clauses 4 to 7 are the plan phase. So a lot of the effort goes into the planning, as you would expect. Then the do that's clause 8. For check, that's clause 9. And act, that's where we look to improve upon what we've done. That is clause 10. So that's how it's kind of laid out. So it's a really nice structure how it's laid out. Now, so that's just my introduction. So I just wanted to get the basics done so that we're all on the same page, if you like. But that's what it is. I think it can be a really powerful tool for organizations to implement, whether you're small, medium, or large. There's something there for everybody. Now, if you want to dive deeper on the standard itself, well, first of all, the standard itself is available online for free. You can check it out, and I'll send a link to it in the follow-up email. But also, my friends over at People Diagnostics have put together a really excellent free online course that you can take. I've taken it. Carrie's gone through it as well. It's really simple. You can step through it at your own pace. So if you want to dive deeper on ISO 45003, there's the website. Again, I'll include the link to it in the follow-up email. So that's my introduction. I'm going to stop sharing now because I think that's all I had for now. And we're going to come back to some questions a little bit later. But Carrie, any thoughts on that? Did I cover everything there, do you think, as an introduction?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the work you've done in kind of making us aware of the ISO 45, I keep saying 45003. I don't know, I'm not used to talking in thousands, but ISO 45003 has really helped me as just start a starting point. Like the webinar or the talk you had with Jason, that really started everything on my side. And then I did the training after that. Yeah, so it really, really helped. And I think the structure, you've laid out the structure well there. That what I'm going to talk about now is kind of going to build on that as well. You see how everything is connected. And I always think that's useful if you're doing a webinar, like especially if there's two pieces, you can kind of see where everything connects.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, thanks for mentioning those. So I'll share all those resources. I had a great podcast with Jason from People Diagnostics. It's a couple of months ago now, but he's a real kind of wealth of knowledge. He put the online course together on 45003. So that's a great podcast that we can include a link to. So there'll be lots of quality resources for everyone attending they'll get after this session then as well on 45003. Now, just before we move on, I better introduce you properly, Carrie. So Carrie is a workplace wellness consultant who supports workers to be happy, healthy, and productive in our digital age. So Carrie works as a community wellness specialist, supporting the health and well-being of a large global community working across over 80 countries. And she also provides workshops and training programs empowering employees to control their digital environments, and that's through her Quokka Wellness business. So listen, Carrie, thanks a million for joining us today. So as I said, I love the idea that we can actually kind of see a live case study. Now, you haven't completed it. You're in the middle of it, if you like. You're a little bit ahead of everybody else. And thanks so much for just going to share kind of some lessons learned with us today. So hopefully someone that's starting out won't maybe make some of the same mistakes, or they can learn kind of from what you've done.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to share a presentation as well. And the copy of these slides will be available afterwards too. I have some working documents as well that I'm happy to share if anyone, would find them beneficial as well. So I'll just share my screen to start.
There we go.
Okay. So you can see my screen there.
That's perfect now. Yep.
Great. Okay. So just a small bit of background. My role as a community wellness specialist is with an organisation called TELUS International, and I manage the health and well-being of a community of global workers across 80 plus countries, as Brian mentioned there. And once I kind of delved into ISO 45003, I realized that it would be a really useful way to support especially the mental well-being of these workers, because we're quite removed from them. It's a really, really large cohort of people across a number of different countries. And I thought it would be really important to look at the way our roles, their particular role and the way their particular work is laid out, and how we as an organisation can ensure that it's a really healthy workflow, that we're supporting it in all avenues. I know Brian mentioned at the start the kind of primary, secondary, tertiary support. That's a really important model that I follow as part of our wellness strategy in my organisation. And I just feel like this ISO could really level it up and give a really strong argument as well to our organisation to look at well-being across the whole spectrum of the workflow, not just in the tertiary area, which is a lot of us work in that. And it's a great place to start, but just to develop it further. So we're going to look at how you can start implementing the standard today to improve the psychological or psychosocial well-being of your workforce. I'm going to use psychosocial and psychological kind of interchangeably. If you do do listen to the podcast afterwards, or any of the other podcasts that are related to this particular training, you'll see where this psychosocial definition came from. But it kind of covers both psychological and psychosocial. So we're looking at people's mental health and well-being, really. So some of the key takeaways from today, I did quite a lot of work. I had time in my role to really delve deeply into the ISO 45003. So I took that time to really understand it. But what I'm hoping is that the work I did in this kind of deep dive will help everyone here who mightn't have had the luxury of time that I had over the past couple of weeks to delve into this. So what I want to do, number one, is to I suppose, clarify the process. What is the process of the ISO? How do you go from step 1 in clause 1 to step 20 in clause 10? How do you get there, and how do you actually implement it in the real world and understand that process? I'd also like to get people to think, instead of being maybe overwhelmed by what might seem like a big body of work, is to really pare it back and just to think that you can start where you are and how you can do that. The third point then would be to speak to your people. This mightn't just be the employees so for my group, it's a really big global group, and we have a lot of work streams that support these. And the way I want to work it is to speak to each of these work streams to understand where we could identify hazards, what we can actually do to improve these or mitigate these. For you, it might be you're supporting a team of 10 or 20 people who are working from home or doing a hybrid model, and you want to support them using this process. The process applies regardless, but I just want to show you how that would look in action, and maybe you could tweak it for your own particular situation. Then we're going to look at a way to assess hazards, one that I found useful, and some alternatives to that as well. And then finally, we're going to look at the control measures. So just to be completely transparent, we're not at our control measure stage yet. I'm really at the identifying hazards step first, but we're looking at control measures and how maybe you could go from your hazard to your control measure, a way to kind of bridge that gap so you can understand how you can either mitigate the hazard or the risk, and how you could look at continuously improving over, say, you might address something now, but it's maybe not ideally how you want it to be, but that you could have a process of continual improvement where you can maybe repeat this process on an annual or every 2-year basis. So you have that continuous improvement cycle, which Brian referred to there in the Plan, Do, Check, Act process. At the center of that is continuous improvement. Okay, so just to start with, really simply, the psychological risk management process is these 4 steps. So these are kind of within that Plan, Do, Check, Act model that the ISO 45003 is based on. So you'll see, if you read it, if you haven't read it yet, each of the clauses, or cluster of clauses, is under the Plan, Do, Check, Act steps. That's how the ISO 45003 is laid out. But the actual risk management process kind of within that is 4 steps. So number 1 is identifying the psychological hazards, and we look at a couple of ways of doing that. Number 2 is assessing the hazard, so looking at the risks and the likelihood of that hazard. The third step then is developing control measures, like I mentioned there, things that will actually mitigate these hazards, and the ISO has a really good way of covering those, and we look at that in detail in a second as well. And the fourth is monitor and review control measures. So if anyone, I have a background in health promotion. I did the workplace wellness postgrad in NUI Galway. This is, and I know some of the people who are here today have that background as well. This monitoring and reviewing element is really, really important too. You want to be able to see if you're having an impact, if the actions are having an impact, how they're having an impact, and can you improve further, or can you make sure that this change you've made can continue on in the process as well. So it's these 4 steps. I've taken this image. I'll be sharing the slides after, so you can see where the image came from, but it's really kind of a straightforward, and like any of these things, it's straightforward in that process, but obviously there's a lot more detail to it when you start working through it. So that's the risk management process in a nutshell. So then the second step, obviously we saw that identify hazards was the first part, and this is just, and I hope you can see it okay here. I'll be sharing the slides afterwards, but this here is just where I started was Excel or Google Sheets. That's my kind of go-to place if I want to start working on something.
I like that, Carrie. That's as practical as you can get. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I know, and I sometimes I like to think that I'm a bit like creative and a bit more fluid and flexible, but actually I'm really, really practical focused. That's I've learned something about myself in the last couple of years. I can't help it. So this is a kind of a practical way to do it. Now I'll just speak through these kind of 5 columns as we go. Just so you can understand where I'm coming from. So B, the actual examples in B are from the actual examples in the ISO 45003. Obviously, in our workflow, I didn't want to share too many details for confidentiality reasons about the hazards that would be really specific to my role. So I've just used some examples here that are from the ISO. So if you look at column B, that is the hazard or the workflow. The way I've decided to do it is identify some workflows that may be hazardous or have hazards within them as well. They can be really, really minor things to things that are maybe a bit more serious in nature as well, or that might need to be addressed sooner. But the reason I did this, so what we do is list the hazards in column B. And the way I've done this, I know with some of the standards that actually identifying hazards is part of getting the certification. Now, we're not 100% sure about certification for this ISO yet, but I decided to start just looking at the workflows from when somebody joined in the particular role that I was looking at, all the way through their life cycle until they finished. And I just looked at that from somebody who's familiar with this particular role type and worked my way through it and said, okay, once we start advertising, once we start recruiting, I looked through every single one of those kind of elements and just identified them that way. Now, that would be a continuous process as well, which we look at in the next step. But it was literally just to write down or have in an ordered fashion a place in each element of that or each workflow where or work stream rather, where I could identify a potential hazard. Now, the idea here would be I'd speak to my people later and we start that process already, and I can start maybe eliminating some of these because they're not applicable or teasing some of them out as well. So that's what
Carrie,
column B was.
So Carrie, this is you just initially looking on your own at the workflows, and then do you intend afterwards, do you bring the people in to understand from your people, either by conversations, focus groups, surveys, whatever, to eliminate 100%. Some of these to add to this list, or how would you do that?
Exactly. So that's the next step, is to identify within which work stream these hazards have been identified in, and it might be across multiple ones. So, for example, it could be in my naming convention for ours. We have terminology like recruitment, community, task. That's the kind of terminology I've used, but for somebody else, it could be within the HR function, the management function, it could be in the operations function, and it's to see where these hazards kind of where they sit, and they could be across multiple functions as well. So without complicating it too much, it was just a list in an ordered fashion from when someone joins the role to when someone finishes. For somebody else, this could be within your team where you look at their day-to-day work. So it could be when they start in the day to when they finish in the day. You could be starting within that framing, and that's completely fine as well. You have to start where you are, as I say here, but that's how I've started, and we're starting some conversations. I'll show in the next slide our kind of work streams that I've decided to pull in on these so that we can work with it. For my particular role, this is going to be quite a broad project, and like I said, we're looking at 12,000 people across 80 plus countries, so it is a kind of a broad undertaking, but it's something I really want to drive. And I see this as not being like a 6-month project. I would see this as being something that I will work on the next 3 to 5 years. It's really going to be a longer term project. But regardless of in which kind of area you frame this, like I said, it could be your group. You could be a manager of a group of 10 or 15 people, and you're looking at their day from when they start their day to when they end their day. Within that, where can you identify the hazards? This process will work as well. So column B, I started with column B, and that's where we started. Ignore C, D, and E for now. We'll look at that in a second. But then what I decided to do, because to understand where you are and where you want to be, you have to have an ideal state. So this might be where you'd ideally see like the perfect scenario where you can see the workflow working. So for example, it could be workload. The workload is too high on our operational people at the moment. You might know that from surveys, you might know that just from speaking on one-to-ones with your people, but you identify that workload is a problem. Ideal state will be that there is an even workload distributed among people, and they are able to manage it within the time allotted to them. So that's the ideal state you're looking at. You may not be able to get there straight away, but you may be able to improve that, mitigate that hazard, and reduce that risk as well. We'll look at that in a little bit. This I found the hardest. So I spoke to my brother, who's a lean engineer, and we discussed it a little bit, and he was like, you have to have an ideal state. You don't know what you're working towards otherwise. I fought with him a bit on this, but I actually think it's a really good exercise to say, okay, what would be the ideal? Where's the perfect scenario here? What would it look like if the hazard was removed? So that's what we looked at then. It might be a bit more difficult to do it. You may decide not to go down that route, but that's the route I've taken. And that's where we have our column A there, our ideal state. So if we look at that first example, lack of consultation and communication about workplace changes, or consultation and communication which is of poor quality. So it would be here, you would ensure that there's consultation, like regular, consistent consultation and communication about workplace changes, and it needs to be of good quality in good time, and that means something to the people you're working with. So that's your ideal state, for example. Like I said, a continuous improvement process, you might not get to the ideal state, and it might be something you need to strive for all the time, but you're looking at how you reduce that risk, even if it's just improving one or two elements of this particular hazard identified here. We look at the hazard assessment in a few minutes, and how we do that. But basically, this column C is a useful way to prioritize what you're going to action. So for example, if you find a hazard that is of a high risk and a high likelihood, then that can be something that you need to address sooner rather than later. So that gives you a high hazard assessment. And we'll look at how you can do that in a second. But the idea here is this: if you are a bit overwhelmed by this particular situation of having to identify your hazards, look at an ideal state, what are you going to start working on first? You could maybe look at assessing your hazards using a matrix, and we'll look at that in a second. But you could look at saying, okay, well, there's some high priority hazards here, or high risk, high likelihood hazards. I need to look at those first. And then there might even be in parallel a couple of low impact and low likelihood hazards that you could actually resolve really, really quickly with some changes. We look at the changes in a second.
And Carrie, I think I'd be right in saying a lot of organizations will already have maybe a template like this in place for their physical health and safety. So it's something they could actually use. They might already have, if they have a health and safety team, speak to the health and safety team, see if they have such a risk assessment template that they can actually reuse for psychological health and well-being.
100%. And I know that you might feel like you're going this alone a little bit, or depending on the size of your organization, but there are resources you can use within the organization, like a risk assessment. You may even just want to like dilute it down to something more simple as well from a physical risk assessment too. This is the matrix that I'm using, and it's just, and you see on the left hand side it's a likelihood gradient, and on the bottom it's harm or risk. So if something is of high likelihood and high risk of harm, then you would that would go into the top right quad there. But if it was low harm, if the actual hazard, the risk associated with the hazard comes true, if it's low likelihood and low harm, then that's going to be a low reading there in the matrix. There's other matrices you can use as well. There could be 1 to 10 on those, depending on what you want to do. But this is the most simplified approach. Obviously, you don't want to, especially at the start, and if this is something as part of your role, you don't want to make it too complicated. But it is something that could be useful to address. So that's how we're doing it here. So that's column C. You may just want to go from identifying your hazards and then assessing the risk of them straight away without looking at your ideal state. That might be the best place for you to start, depending. Because what it does then, it just gives you a couple that you can really focus on that can have either a really good impact or that you can do quickly as well. Column D is the resolution hierarchy. I look at that at the last slide. And then you can see column E is the resolution process. So that's actually going to be the act part, or the do part rather. So where you actually say, okay, these are the resolutions that we've come up with. These are the control measures. You might need to document those, or you might just need to list them. It could be something really small, or it could be something much, much bigger that you need to include other people in your organization in. So they are some of the examples here. For example, we're looking at our I'll just take the last example here quickly to walk through. Because we're looking at 80 plus countries in our particular situation, working in unstable environments such as conflict zones is definitely something that's likely in some scenarios, in some countries, for example, and the impact could be quite high. So we want to make sure we can support people there. So we need to look at a way that we can support that. I would identify that as high in our particular situation. Even though the likelihood is low because it's only going to affect a couple of countries, the impact it could have is high. So I would look at that as something that's high and something that we would need to address as an example. Okay, so then when we talk about talking to your people, you can see here I've just used some columns. And if you picture this Excel or this Google Sheet as going across, this is the next row of set of columns that would appear. So you're looking then at either, as Brian mentioned there are some really useful tools out there. You can survey your people if you want to start with the people who are actually working within the roles, and which is something that we're going to do. But I'm also looking at the people who are support or operationally supporting the people who are working in these roles as well. So we're looking at our recruitment team, we're looking at our community team, which is our operational team. We're looking at our quality team, the tasks here as well. We're looking at our payments team. So if, for example, a hazard you could identify that people could potentially not get paid on time. That's a hazard, and it's a psychosocial hazard that can have a real impact on people if they don't get their payment in time. And that's one I've identified as well. So what I've done is listed all the hazards that I could identify on my own. I've identified which work stream they are part of. And then the next step is to go and speak to these people and say, okay, is this really a hazard? Is this something that we could work on? Is this something that we can resolve? And the next step here, and this is where I really like the ISO 45003 as well, is it doesn't just tell you how to identify things and how to pull the people in to talk about them. It actually gives you a resolution process too, which ties in really nicely with that kind of WHO framework, and in particular that primary, secondary and tertiary model of supporting well-being in the workplace as well. So this is how I have done it. You may use different terminology, you may have different org structures or work streams, but it can be really useful to not just speak to the people who are, so for example, if you're managing a team of maybe 15 people, you're looking at their workday beginning to end, and you say, okay, this is where they have told me that they're having some issues, this is where I've identified some hazards, but you also always have HR supporting them, you have the payments team supporting them, you might have other operational teams that kind of overlap with them, and you may really need to work with those people as well to mitigate those hazards that you've identified, and to maybe make them aware. They may not be aware of this standard that's available there, and ways that you can actually reduce or mitigate these hazards too. Okay, so that's just, again, an Excel-based, really simple, straightforward way of converting the ISO 45003 into an actual working document, and something that you can work from, that is flexible, it's adaptable, and that you can look back on if you want to have a continuous improvement process assigned with that as well. So you're saying, okay, fantastic. I have identified the hazards. I've identified the people involved. I've looked at how you can assess the hazards, whether a hazard is low, medium, high, whether it's on a 1 to 10 scale, however you want to do it. What can I actually do then? How can I actually mitigate the hazards and remove them if needed, or manage them in some way? And this is where we're going at our control measures. So this is also in the ISO 45003, and anyone who's done maybe health promotion or the workplace wellness postgrad, or some of the training that Brian has delivered too, might recognize some of these. There's this inverted triangle again. If we looked at, that's kind of flipped the one that Brian showed, but the kind of structure is the same, it's just reversed in this triangle here. The best thing you can do if you identify a hazard, or the most impactful thing you can do, or the most effective thing you can do, is remove the hazard, especially if it's a high hazard too. Now, in a lot of cases, that's not possible. So you can't remove work of people. So if high workload is an issue, you can't remove the work of people. It's just not possible. What you need to do is maybe look at one of the other controls here. So is it substitution? You replace a hazard with something else. Is that possible? So if we look at the physical work environment, it could be replacing one particular chemical that's really highly volatile or highly risky with another chemical that's less risky. That would be an example in the physical world. But if you're looking at the psychosocial world, it could be replacing maybe people being on the phones, or substituting people being on the phones to support people for 8 hours a day. Maybe you replace that with having a shift of 3 blocks of of 2 hours, for example. It could be that they're just getting really, really overwhelmed with the amount and the volume of work, for example. Engineering controls.
Carrie, the language used here, again, they've pretty much used the same language that you would use,
Yes.
again, for physical health and safety, all the way down to the PPE there.
Yeah.
It might sound a little bit funny, but it's
It is
just
funny.
they just kept the same standard language that you would use for a physical health and safety risk assessment.
Exactly, 100%. Even the PPE, it kind of jars a bit. They may change that terminology at a point, but it is personal protective equipment. And it might be that if you look at some of your hazards, you'll probably be in the bottom 3 triangles a lot of the time. But if you want to strive towards that continuing improvement, as we said, you can only start where you are. You can make those improvements incrementally, but the idea is that you're moving towards this ideal. And at a certain point, you may be able to substitute that hazardous process, especially if it's, like I said, on the high end of a hazard, with something that's less risky. You might be able to eliminate it completely. You might be moving towards that, but that's where organizations really want to move towards, having a safe, a psychosocial structure as possible. So the engineering controls, a lot of the time they will be actually using some kind of a technical solution. An administrative control could be changing the way people work, so changing their working hours. This could be something like introducing flexible working time, a 4-day week, which I know is a big topic of discussion as well. That could be an administrative control, just changing the way people work to support their psychosocial well-being. And then the PPE part, if you're looking for an example of this in the real world, it could be something like resilience training. So you know that there are difficult scenarios and you're kind of protecting people against those, how they can support themselves in an individual level. So that's our PPE. You might find, if you start, and not to be put off, that a lot of these might just be your PPE and administrative controls, and that's where you need to start. You know, you can't you can't change the world all in one go. So that, you know, that might be a really, really good starting point. You're already addressing the hazards. That's the really important part. You're identifying them and addressing them in whatever way you can. It's brilliant to strive towards, you know, the more effective and more impactful controls as well, but it may not be available to you, especially at the start.
And Carrie, just to give a very simple example, like you could be speaking to your team and find out that they really cannot stand that. Let's say the roster comes out at 5 p.m. on a Friday, and they've no time to plan for. Maybe let's say they might be working on a Saturday to Sunday to Monday, whatever it might be. But it might be a case of just changing the process, working back on the process to the roster comes out by 5 p.m. every Wednesday. And all of a sudden, there's that hazard eliminated, really, isn't it?
Exactly. And like that's the way we have to kind of look at it too. And I know a lot of us who work in workplace wellness, we have a background in an interest in physical health and well-being and supporting people's wellness. We maybe enjoy delivering classes or delivering talks about different areas of well-being. But really, when it comes down to it, if we can build that well-being into the process, that's really that's the best way to support people's psychosocial well-being, and to really have an impact as well. And I know for some people, this risk management approach, I know you alluded to it at the start, Brian, as well, can be a little bit like snooze. Oh my God, here we go. But it really, looking at it as from a whole, can have a really, really good impact. Like I said, that could ruin somebody's weekend if they get that roster at 5 o'clock on a Friday.
And think about it, Carrie. Like, so there's no bowls of fruit or yoga classes mentioned here. But their interventions, they can be useful interventions. But you can imagine that person who's really annoyed, really frustrated at that roster coming out at that time continuously every single whatever day it is, and then you're giving them a bowl of fruit and a yoga class to try and or a mindfulness app to try and make up for that. You can see how that just doesn't work, or the frustrations will just grow and grow. It's eliminating those hazards, those organizational hazards. That's the foundation, and then you layer the interventions on top, like the physical activity, mental health first aiders, your EAP program. You layer those on top, but this is the foundational stuff we're talking about.
That's it, exactly. And like a lot of people will have to start at possibly the things like the bowls of fruit or the EAP, like ourselves. EAP was our first port of call because we identified a hazard and we needed to eliminate it. Now, we didn't use that terminology because we hadn't implemented this structure yet, or we hadn't looked at this structure yet. But that was where we had to start with. This hazard was a high one. There wasn't people there wasn't a support for people there if they did encounter issues because we didn't have that expertise in house. So that was the first port of call. And that's often where people start. But it's just to improve it then and to really make a robust process around it. Like you said, all of these are either process changes, they could be interventions. And if you think about the bowl of fruit and the yoga class example there, they're still really important. But if somebody's head is already frustrated or worried about the rostering setup, they can't really engage with that, and they might even actively disengage with it too. But if somebody's in a good headspace because of the way the work is set up and they've been listened to as well, that can be really beneficial, and they'll start to engage more with these, what I suppose are probably classically considered the softer sides of well-being, and that as well. And if you're looking at somewhere to start, and maybe if you're not sure where to identify some of these hazards as well, or what people are struggling with, a really good tool or resource that's free, especially for anybody who's in Ireland, is the Work Positive CI, Psychosocial Risk Management Process. So it's actually a set up survey, an already established survey that will give you some indicators of where there might be some psychological or psychosocial risks. It's actually been set up for that. It's under workpositive.ie, I think is the name of the website. I have a link
exactly,
here anyway.
Workpositive.ie.
And yeah, exactly. And the CI is for critical incident. They have a critical incident piece in it as well for maybe people who are working the front line or might actually encounter critical incidences as part of their day-to-day work. So they added that piece afterwards. But it can be a really good way just to identify some stuff. It will also benchmark where you are, either as an organization or as a team, against other people who have taken that Work Positive survey too. So, you can do what you want with that benchmarking.
And it's just funny, isn't it, Carrie? We were just saying Work Positive has been around for quite a few years, but I don't think many organizations really knew about it, number one, or two, knew what to do with it. Whereas all of a sudden now we have our standards. The ISO 45003 standard is there that we can educate ourselves on. And here's already created a GDPR'd to within an inch of its life survey tool that we can use, a psychosocial risk assessment tool, actually.
That's actually what it's called.
It is, yeah. And it's there for us, and it's free. And it's completely free for organizations to get started on.
Exactly. And I know exactly what you said, Brian. We were talking about that beforehand. That might have been where the survey, this Work Positive survey, was kind of getting lost a bit, because you get all this information about like where the problems were, but you didn't have so much a framework of how you could resolve them. So sometimes it's not nice or not useful for you to know about these issues if you don't know where to go or what the next steps are to resolve them. And like I said,
that's a really good point, actually. If you don't have the time, if you are going to do a survey or go to the trouble of looking at this, but you don't have the time to take action, you're almost wasting your time. You're wasting everyone's time, because you need.
It can have a negative effect too.
Exactly.
People get frustrated. They ask me what the problem was. I've told them, and now they haven't done anything.
You haven't done anything about it. That can just increase the frustration. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's that kind of covers a lot. I know there's a lot in it, and like I said, I'm working my way through it as well in my head, but I just felt like I was so excited about this once I started, especially after the training, and I took that time to go through the document really piece by piece. And what's brilliant in it is the examples. Like you went through those 3 major headings, Brian, as well. Like they give examples, because sometimes it's hard for us to think, if you're going to survey, what to even ask, or where there might be issues, and it gives you some really good examples there. But I was so excited. I was telling people in work, and I started working on this. I'm the only wellness person in my team, so I could see eyes kind of glazing over after 10 minutes. I was like, okay, I need to package this a little bit. It'd be a little bit funkier to get it across, but I was really glad to be able to talk about it today, because I just feel like it could have such an impact, like short term and long term as well.
Big time. And thanks so much for sharing that today, Carrie. Really appreciate it. And companies of all sizes can do something here. Now, I know if you're looking at the whole thing and trying to implement the whole thing, you're probably going to be a larger organization with a dedicated resource. But even if you're just at a team level, a small team, get your team into a room, or whatever way you do it best, to understand like what annoys people, what frustrates people. Have a conversation with them. There's your starting point, and get that in an Excel sheet like Carrie has just shown us there. How do you start to try and eliminate substitute, follow the process, some of those risks. And that's your start. That's a really, really good starting point for a team of any size, an organization of any size.
Yeah. And like you can look at it as well. You can give yourself a target of maybe 1 high risk, 2 medium, and 5 low, things that maybe you can address. Just give yourself a target, because it can seem so overwhelming. And some people here now looking at the list that I should, my list is maybe 50 odd items long, and that would probably grow and flex as we go through it. But you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, start where you
I
are,
think
use
you're
what you have.
responsible for 12,000 resources, if I'm not mistaken. That's who you're working with, isn't it?
Yeah, it is quite broad, and it is an unusual structure, I know, in our organization. So I want to try and make it, I know we discussed it beforehand, this is applicable regardless of the size of your group or what you're trying to address. Yeah. And I know someone asked there about the ISO accreditation.
So that's Suzanne. So Suzanne from AIB there. Yeah. Hi, Suzanne. So you touched on this, Carrie. I was going to give it a mention. So as it turns out, you can't actually, there's no formal accreditation for 45,003. There is for the parent standard, 45,001, but that's a much wider occupational health standard and certification. For 45,003, what has happened to date is, so the BSI, the British Standards Institute, they have, I think, what they're calling an unaccredited accreditation, something along those lines. So effectively an audit. But so there's no official accreditation. I don't believe they have plans to do so either. But I mean, watch this space. So what that means essentially is it's voluntary. It's a voluntary standard. But I think we've clearly demonstrated the value that can be had by adhering to this standard. And I mean, almost by default, you're actually ticking the legal compliance box as well. Because again, I took a note of it while you were speaking there. The Health and Safety Act, if for anyone tuning in from Ireland, the Health and Safety Act from 2005, it's actually a legal requirement to maintain a risk assessment. If you run an organization, a business, it's a legal requirement to maintain a risk assessment. It's a health and safety risk assessment. But of course, I think we all now know that psychological health and safety falls within that. So it is actually a legal requirement to maintain that risk assessment.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, we work with some really large customers in our organization, and just to give them that, it's not even peace of mind, but it's just to show that we're taking this seriously, and we have a framework and a structure of how we're supporting the workers that are doing, we're a service provider that are doing the work for these larger customers, I think is really important. And we're being proactive too, which a lot of the time, a lot of these larger organizations and customers, that's what they want to see. They want to see their providers really driving on ingenuity and making sure that they're like being proactive, and health and well-being of the workforce is becoming more and more important now as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. If there's any final questions or any questions, pop them into the chat there. We can try and answer them. Have you come across, with your work, Carrie, have you identified any hazards, but you found you couldn't remove them? Any examples of that?
Yeah, I would say a lot of hazards at the moment. So the biggest issue I see with this particular standard, or with anything like this when you're trying to make changes, is there's resistance in the other work streams. So I would identify something, for example, I'd love to have some more screening in the initial onboarding of people that join our organization for different pieces. But there's KPIs and our recruitment team that they need to hire certain amounts of people within a month. That's just a kind of a very high level generic example. So it's that friction that I can't just introduce this screening process. So if I want to eliminate a hazard, to actually eliminate it, what I need to do is introduce something rather than remove something. And that would maybe be, I suppose, your engineering piece. And that would probably fall under the engineering control. But I can't introduce it yet. So I have to do it kind of a little bit more slowly, get the work streams on site, and explain how it can have such a positive impact, how it can have a positive impact downstream too. If you don't identify somebody early on in the screening, it may cause more issues further downstream. And you may not be able to support a person as well as you could if you identify them early on. It doesn't mean that you don't hire them, for example, but you may put them through a different channel. They may get more training at the start. So it's that's where I see the friction. There's a lot of things you can't remove, but that you have to actually just manage in some way.
Sure.
But if they're high risk, I think they're definitely worth focusing on.
Brilliant. Yeah. There seems clearly lots of interest in the area, with lots of people registering. There's lots of kind of comments coming in as well. So we might have to get you back at some stage to talk about hopefully maybe 6 months,
To be
12 months.
crying, going, I can't. No,
Rip
no,
it up.
it's yeah, no. Like honestly, it's one of those things where I've just been more and more interested the more I've learned. I'm not a standards
Mm,
person. I
yeah,
familiarized myself a little bit with 45001 because it is the parent standard, and just to
sure.
understand a little bit even how to assess how you're identifying hazards. That was another piece.
Yeah.
Like it's not necessary for this one, but I just thought it was interesting. But it's just, you'll get you'll inch your way through, and then they'll take big jumps, and then you inch again, and then take big jumps. That's how I see it. And like at the end of the day, the heading on any of my presentations that I do to our clients or internally is community welfare comes first, and that's kind of the northern light, or the guiding light that I have. That's where
Yeah.
you have to go. So if it's questioned, that's we're doing this for the welfare of our community. That's what we call our group of global workers. Yeah.
There's a nice easy question from Leanne there
Yeah.
to finish up with. How do you get
How
the
do you
full
get full
buy-in from
buy-in?
leaders?
It's not easy, and the
No.
leaders will buy in. I find leaders will
Mm.
definitely tell you, like, this is the best thing we can do, is to try and get the operational
Yeah.
other work streams
If
to support that as well.
if you can, I guess if you can get the message is, like, I do hear this all the time, and it's very well intentioned organizations when we're having this conversation. And I spoke to Jason about this.
Mm,
I hear them say, okay, we've got an EAP program, brilliant, because they're excellent programs. We've got our mental health first aiders, another excellent program, fantastic. But then they kind of say, and then we're done. We've done mental health.
yeah,
And we're finished, we're sorted. Everything's fine. And everyone's back to work now and they're fine. Whereas like as we highlighted earlier, they're your secondary and your tertiary
primary.
interventions there. So the issues potentially probably already exist. And it's forcing the issue, making it self-care, forcing the issues back on the individual to take action, to sort themselves out, as opposed to addressing the organizational issues at source, which is what 45,003 does. So if you can get that message to the organization that we're here, we want to prevent the issues arising in the first place, the stressors in the first place. A good example is, a fantastic intervention some organizations have been giving is a day off or a week off if you have that luxury to employees. Well, think about it. So they're having a lovely break, a week off, but they're coming back to the organization to the very same stressors that potentially were causing burnout, friction, frustration in the beginning. So nothing has been addressed. That's what we're talking about, trying to address the preventative issues. What can we do to prevent these stressors arising in the first place?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And like, I think one way, if you do need to get buy-in from leaders and you find them very resistant, even the term risk or hazard has some connotations to it too. Say we're eliminating risks. If we don't do this, then we're leaving those risks there on the table, that we know they're there. So sometimes the language, it depends on who the leaders are, or the culture of your organization too. But sometimes coming in that avenue as well can help. Just even the terminology of risk management and that kind of thing can help your argument.
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, lots of questions coming in as always towards the end. Done with mental health. Yeah, thanks, Anya.
Click. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Done. Yeah, exactly. We're done with it. Kind of move on. As we've highlighted a few times, this is a bit like, so my 8-step framework is the very same. It's a continual improvement process. You're never done with it. You're never done.
Yeah.
You never tick the box and done. This is, you're constantly looking for improvements over time. It's a time investment. It's long term. It's absolutely not a tick the box. It's not a one size fits all, and it's not a one off. This is an investment over time. It's going to take quite some time. But it's absolutely worth the investment.
I see that someone mentions there about if they have the budget to pursue the IBEC Keep Well mark for formal. So there are formal accreditations there too, but they cover health and well-being generally. They don't focus particularly on the psychosocial or psychological well-being.
Exactly.
I would say if you do take on board anybody like that, this is my own opinion. Sorry, Brian, but if it's a Keep Well mark or any of the other accreditations about health and well-being in the workplace, speak to them, because they will be there. They'll have auditors there. Ask them, what they think about the standard, how they think it could be beneficial, because it might be something that they add to their own suite of factors too, or it might be something that they already have in, maybe not called as such, but they might have a psychosocial health and well-being, which they definitely do, have a psychosocial or psychological well-being element to the Keep Well mark too. So I would say speak to them.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if we see, as we've kind of mentioned, there's no formal certification, certainly not in Ireland at the moment.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity for someone to get out there and put something together, put a team in place or an audit in place to accredit this, to certify this. Because as I said,
You're on, Brian.
well, I'll tell you. I'll see what I can do. See what I can do. We should get together on that.
Yeah.
Listen, conscious of people's time, conscious of your time, Carrie. Listen, thanks
I'm
so
fine
much.
anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to hang on for a minute or two as well if
Same.
you want to hang on, but I know people want to probably pop off and head for lunch. Listen, thanks to everyone who's joined us. Thanks a million to Carrie. I'll share all the details that we've had here. I've got quite a list of resources here, so really useful resources. So they'll go out in the email. So make sure you're registered. Once you're registered, you'll get that email. If you're not on the WorkWell mailing list, send me a note or sign up through. You can get it on workwellireland.ie. I'll just put it up again. You get the sign up to the mailing list there. So I'll be sending that out in the next day or so. I'll send it all the resources. workwellireland.ie, that's where you'll get all. We try and have regular webinars. We've lots of podcasts built up on this and similar subjects. There's blogs, there's articles, there's workshops, there's training if you want to dive deeper. The 8-step framework, for example, that's an overall. That's looking at the 4 areas, if you like. It's actually securing buy-in for leaders is actually step 1 on that framework. That's step 1, getting your leadership bought in. It's a whole process. It's a whole framework, if you like, to step you through. And part of that, would go very well hand in hand with, let's say, if you wanted to adopt or take on some of ISO 45003, that would work very well as well. So take a look at that. We'll include Carrie's details in the email as well. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us. Have a lovely day, and we're going to hang on for a while, but listen, thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's Margaret. What did you think of Restream, Carrie? How did you find that?
Yeah, it was fine. It's really comfortable. It's not jarring at all. I stayed out of the Restream window and I just stayed in my presentation window.
Yeah.
So I didn't see the comments or anything, so I just felt like it would be. I thought I might, but it would probably just be distracting more than anything.
I know,
knew you were there. Yeah, how was it on your end?
Oh, perfect. Yeah, it worked really well. Yeah, it worked really, really good. It's impossible to tell kind of how many people are joining because there's 4 different streams going out there. But it looks really good. It looks really good. I see a lot of people still on LinkedIn. There's 21 still on LinkedIn, for example.
Okay, great.
16 on, I think that might be, is that YouTube? Yeah, 16 on YouTube.
It's the way forward just to get across all the platforms, isn't it? Because we all have our preferences.
I know. Just a nice way to do it, I think, yeah.
I sent you the presentation there, the PDF, Brian, so.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I'll get that out. I'll PDF up my own. I think we've covered all the questions. If anyone has any final questions and they're still on live, drop us a note there. Or if I've missed anything, could possibly have missed something, let me know. Be happy to share.
I know you feel like you could talk about it forever, like.
Yeah, you could. It's great to see the interest, though, isn't it? I'm not seeing a whole lot of people outside of or inside of Ireland, should I say, talking about it. So it's nice to give it a bit of promotion. Ireland and the UK. Well, the BSI, in fairness, are doing a great job in the UK.
They're really pushing, yeah. And it's just interesting the certification as well, because I wonder the effort that people might go to, to certify. Oh yeah, 45001.
Oh, but I forgot to mention, I will share the replay. The replay will go up automatically as well on all the channels. So we'll share the replay. So if anyone missed the start. Yeah, so Sid just mentioning. As would. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I know, obviously the parent is ISO 45001, but they're also, it's also a standalone.
Yes.
And this could be where the accreditation question is coming from, because it does kind of state in 45003 that it should be part of an overarching OH&S framework that you have in the workplace, but it's kind of been dealt with as a standalone too.
Yeah, it's coming in again, like Sean is asking about it. It's a good question. So I have been on webinars with the guys who pretty much developed the standard, and there's no urgency anyway to create a certification for it at the moment. It's currently voluntary. They watch this space at the moment. Oh, and actually, as it turns out, I was speaking to Dr. Stavrula Leka. You've probably come across her, Carrie. She's down in UCC, but she's almost like the Irish representative on the board. I think she might have been the chairperson of the board that was putting F45003 together, or pulling it together. A mammoth task, because there was people from many different jurisdictions involved. So she will hopefully join us for either a webinar or a podcast in the near future. She's incredibly busy. Yeah. So that would be like ISO 45003 royalty to have on the show. So
Queen.
Yeah, so that would be fantastic. So watch this. It won't be this side of Christmas, I would say, but maybe early in the new year, we'll try and get Stavrula to come on, and so we can ask the really detailed questions like about the certification and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like it's probably going to be a work in progress too. I imagine that they'll.
Cheers, Sid.
Like. They'll work their way through it too. What I was really impressed with as well, I don't know if anybody really left, but the simple language that they use, it's not,
yes.
I know we discussed that before, it's not, you don't have to, there's a lot of content, but you don't have to try and have like legal jargon or,
no,
it's not jargony.
It's not, it is really easy to step through. It is. Yeah. Brilliant, Carrie. I think we're done. I think we might be able to go and have some lunch there now. So I think
stuff.
Everyone's, Listen, Carrie, thanks so much. You've sent me on those details. I will package everything up and get it out there, include your details in the email that goes out as well. So anyone still remaining, if they want, make sure you're on the WorkWell mailing list, and you'll get that update in the next day or so.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Take care.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.